everything coming along in the courses for you?
I find myself getting hung up on the same stuff. Logic games, I am so confident in. They're actually fun for me. So it's really just the logic reasoning. There are certain question types that I find no matter how much I study or listen to things or read things, and it seems like it clicks. And then when I actually go to do the practice test, just something falls apart. So
yeah, we'll look to definitely get into that today. Are there certain particular specific question types where you notice this happening?
Yeah, what I had emailed you about last week, the linking the sufficient condition or necessary condition within the sufficient assumption questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Those, there were 4 in particular. I actually wrote them down. I don't know if you want them, just so you know, like which questions I'm having problems with. I feel when I read it, I go, this is so straightforward. The language is easy to understand. It's not one of the questions that uses horribly dense language. So I'm going into it confident, and I answer it, and I move on quick, 1, 2, 3. And then I go back and I go, well, why did I get it wrong? And I linked it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right, so we definitely want to look at analyzing the conditional indicator words a bit to see where can we properly make connections and where can't we make those connections.
Yeah, because I even wrote down in some of my notes on a few of the questions that when I went back and took time to reread it, I wrote in one of my notes, the indicator word I confused for indicating a different thing. So, yeah.
That's exactly the kind of thing you want to be doing. Do you have a running list of those questions that gave you difficulty?
Yeah, the way I take it, because I don't want to write in my books, because I go back to the same questions so frequently, I don't want to keep erasing. I keep notes like this, where next to each question, I write down what I'm thinking when I answer it, and then when I go back and review it, I write down, okay, well, I got it wrong, so let me reread the answer I chose. I write down why I think that answer is wrong, and then I try and break down the correct answer to understand it. I've been doing that. It's these questions with linking the necessary and sufficient conditions. I am actually, it's like the 3rd time I'm doing it. I'm writing it down. I'm doing this process. Still not getting it.
Have you looked at my article cataloging the various underlying formulas for sufficient assumption questions?
I think so. I've read probably like 4 from the blog post and then watched the videos about it, but I'm not sure if I read that exact one. The one that I have used recently was one that actually gave a list of the LSAT questions with the 6 most difficult types.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay. I haven't gotten through all of the questions that you gave for examples, but I did notice that some of the example questions on there are the ones that I am continuing to struggle with.
Good. Well, I'm glad that you've got that list, and I'm glad you started to work through it. My recommendation for you, Kelsey, is to work through the questions in those lists by category so that you can see the underlying commonalities between these different particular types of sufficient assumption questions. I went through all the sufficient assumption questions in 40 exams and categorize them into those particular formula categories. And so one way you can get a hint as to how to solve that question is to see which category is it falling within, what will be the key to unlocking it.
Okay.
And I would suggest you try to diagram that stimulus and predict the answer in line with how that formula lays it out.
Okay. So as far as diagramming, I've been trying to avoid diagramming LR questions because I find myself getting obsessive compulsive about it and it eating a little bit of time. But when I'm having difficulty with linking the proper terms or phrases within the stimulus, diagramming is something that is recommended?
Yeah, it depends on the question type. I do not recommend diagramming the vast majority of LSAT logical reasoning questions because most of them are informal logic, not formal. But there are a handful of types where diagramming is often useful, and sufficient assumption questions are one of those, which is why I laid it out in that article listing the formulas. If you just diagram the stimulus in line with that relevant formula, you can actually predict the correct answer, then just scan for it in the choices.
Okay. So with the linking of everything, especially with sufficient assumption, I have noticed that my brain, when I get to those questions, especially because you're going from informal logic and just pre-phrasing the answer, and then when I get to the sufficient assumption, it's kind of like my brain has to switch gears back to formal logic, and that change isn't happening quick enough. So whether or not I get them right, I'm wasting time switching back, but diagramming could really help just move that process along. So my brain isn't just sitting there rereading it.
Yeah, diagramming is a tool like any other, and sometimes it is worth bringing out that tool. Logical reasoning, of course, is frustrating because you're constantly switching between different things within the section. You're not going to have a bunch of sufficient assumptions in a row, of course. But the LSAT is also a test of pattern recognition. And so if you can look at a new question and relate it back to all the previous ones of that type you've done, you're not reinventing the wheel on test day. You're just saying, oh, it's this particular formula. I do X, Y, Z, and it spits out the result. So you want to just become really proficient in this through practice.
Okay. This is the one question type that I am just, for some reason, the other ones I've seen improvement on, and this one, I'm sitting at the same percentage correctness or accuracy since I started, but with the formal logic and the other parts of the exam, and I'm okay. So it is frustrating, but I do see where I just need to recognize the pattern, break it down, and not worry about the content.
Exactly. Okay. And I would feel free to diagram these. You don't need to diagram every single sufficient assumption question. Some are worth doing, some aren't. Out of the 6 in that list I have there, the first couple are simple enough that diagramming isn't really necessary. But for some of the other categories, it's definitely worth doing.
Okay. So specifically, I'm just going to grab my book. So another thing that I've noticed is that the questions that I find have the simplest language or short in their passage, I just assume they're going to be super easy. And then I get there and the logic is actually far more complex than the questions that give you these long 26-letter bacteria names.
Right.
So it's, is there any way or a practice technique you would recommend for, I know I do this, and for some reason I still just breeze through them because I go, oh, it's in simple English. Are there specific, should I be looking at older exams or something where is there a specific tactic you would say or recommend for me to stop breezing over these questions that I know in my heart, these are the questions that give me problems, but I feel confident about it when I'm answering it, and I go back and they're wrong when I review?
Sure. Well, first off is I'd look at where it appears in the section. If it's a question number 19 or question 21, it's likely to be a hard question. And so it's worth slowing down and not taking everything at face value at first glance. If it's a number 5, then I would say you're most likely going to want to go with your gut.
Okay.
Then you also want to look at indicator words like evidence, conclusion, or conditionality, and look at those to help you find the structure of the argument rather than getting too focused on the details.
Okay. With the indicator words, I have, I've written out the list and I've watched your videos, and I love how straightforward it is that you're taking simple English and going, these words are used in simple English every single day, but on the LSAT, think about what they're really meaning, what their place is in the stimulus. And so I write them down and I get a little bit compulsive with it, and I study it. I have little note cards with them broken down. But there are indicator words that for some reason I'm still glossing over as if they're not presenting a specific part of the argument. I'm looking at them and going, well, because doesn't mean, like, I'm skimming over simple words like that. For drilling questions and doing things like that, is would just breaking down the stimulus be a good drill and not even worrying about the answer, just literally breaking down the parts of the stimulus?
Absolutely. I would look to see, first off, what's the conclusion? Find the conclusion first. That's your first step. Then find the evidence. And then lastly, see what role do the other pieces play? Like, are they filler, or is it counter premise, or is it a multi-layered argument with evidence, sub-conclusion, and main conclusion? Those are the kinds of things you want to be looking for. But step one always is ID the conclusion. Find that, then see what else is the evidence. Then, of course, you can start to evaluate the method of reasoning a little bit.
Okay. One of the things that I've noticed in my earlier patterns of getting things incorrect was misidentifying a premise that serves as the conclusion for an earlier premise as the main conclusion and glossing over the stimulus's true main conclusion. So I do need to work on that. And I think that that's a really big part of where I'm messing up the sufficient assumptions and not plugging in the evidence with the correct premising.
Yeah, it's a very easy mistake to make, and it takes time to analyze these to start to see the patterns in the fact that, of course, they can present things to you in any order at all. They can put the main conclusion in the middle. Doesn't have to be at the beginning, doesn't have to be at the end. So you do have to think a little bit, especially in the absence of indicator words. How do these things actually relate to each other? Which part is supporting the other? And if they could only say one single thing, what would they keep? That one thing they would keep would be the main conclusion.
Okay. So when it gets down to a 50-50 guess, and again, my worst 50-50 guesses are with sufficient assumption questions. I am with flaw and must be trues, once I cross off 3 and it's down to 2, I'm just, okay, well, my gut said this, so move along. And it's typically right. But with the sufficient assumption, I'm not trusting my gut, and the 50-50 thing is not going in my favor. Is there anything along the lines of, because this is going into, in my head at least, I'm not picking the right out of the 50-50 choices left because the conclusion. Is there anything I can do to fix that?
Yeah, well, for sufficient assumption questions, what they're asking you for is new information that, when combined with the evidence, will guarantee the conclusion. So you could, once you've siloed off what's the conclusion, you can then take the evidence from the stimulus, combine it with a given answer choice, and see if those two things together would guarantee the conclusion. So if you had, for example, evidence says A requires B, and a given answer choice said B requires C, those two pieces together would equal or lead to or support A requires C. It would guarantee that indirectly. And so if your conclusion was A requires C, then the sufficient assumption B requires C would be your answer. So
okay.
You could just look to see formulaically and diagramming things if this choice does in fact guarantee the conclusion when combined with the evidence.
Okay. Now, what about when there are two choices that it's the matter of one word in A versus C that is different and everything else is the same? When do you know? And it's not even a numeric. It's not a many versus some. It's just one word's different. And there are a few questions that I found where sometimes I'm getting the question right, and sometimes I'm just taking it that next step, and that next step is too far. With sufficient assumption questions, you don't want to go too far, right? Or you can go that extreme. I'm having difficulty placing, I know sufficient assumption and necessary. One, you can go with the extreme, and one is just do enough.
Yeah. So for sufficient assumption, it can be as extreme as you want, as long as it gets the job done. And so I wouldn't feel the need to gravitate towards more moderate language for sufficient assumption. But although for necessary assumption, you do want to gravitate towards more moderate language, all else being equal. And I find that necessary assumption questions, you're more often in that situation where you're down to two, they both look pretty similar. And so you can, as a general heuristic, say more moderate is better. For sufficient assumption, though, I don't find it's as often two choices that are virtually identical, and it's the degree of certainty or the extreme language that varies. I think for sufficient assumption, and in general, you don't really want to compare two choices against each other. You want to check them against the stimulus and see if they are achieving the given task that you're looking to do. And so I would say, trust in your diagramming whenever applicable. Otherwise, just see if this answers the general question, does this guarantee the conclusion? And extreme is totally fine, though.
Okay, because I don't know why I had in my head that you just don't pick the extreme answer. And I was making that mistake of comparing answer choices against each other. But I'll know now in the future to not do that. That was definitely something I was doing, which obviously doesn't help answer the question.
Sure. Yeah, just know what your question type is looking for. Inference family questions like must be true, and in my opinion, necessary assumption, you want to gravitate towards more moderate, but for strengthen, weaken, sufficient assumption, extreme is totally fine. Just a question of which family they fall within.
Okay. And now with the questions that you had mentioned earlier, the later they are in the section, obviously a simple phrasing, it's not going to be as simple or straightforward as it is to the eye. However, those are the ones that I'm getting through the question. And then question 24 is one of those questions. And I'm so confident I go, oh, they gave an easy one at the end. Maybe the next question's really hard, but that's the hard question. When do I spend an extra few seconds, 30, 40 seconds on a question that I'm hung up on? And when do I just move on and say, you know what, I'll guess or I'll come back to it when it's towards the end of the section?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a tough judgment call. I mean, you really want to make sure that you don't get bogged down, though. And so if you're spending minute after minute and your understanding is not increasing, you're not making any headway, and you find that 30, 40 seconds is just not giving you any additional information, you might start to panic a little bit. That's when I would say cut your losses, flag it, skip it, come back to it at the end if you have time. And personally, I'll flag 3 or 4 questions in a single logical reasoning section to come back to at the end just because they were too tough to deal with in the moment. And there's a general order of difficulty, but not a perfect order of difficulty. And so question 24 could be slightly easier than question 21. Typically, it'll be that 21's a level 5 and 24 is a level 4, or maybe the occasional level 3. Nothing super easy, but it is worth skipping some and coming back to them later. And so have a general sense for yourself, which are the types that you'd like to skip. Like maybe it's parallel or principal application, or where it's written very tightly in a very formal logic sort of way, where you might, or you just don't like the topic, whatever it may be. But choose your 3 to 4. And I would say if you can move at a fast enough pace, you will actually have time to come back at the end.
Okay. And now with the flagging, I do like that feature on the new tablet version of the exam, because flipping back and forth in the pages in my practice exams is time consuming. There are available practice exams on the LSAT website, very limited number though. How do you recommend using those in my study? Should I do all 4 closer to test day, or should I sprinkle them throughout my studying?
That's a great question. I would recommend sprinkling them, but towards the end. So maybe do 1 per week over the 4 weeks leading up to test day. And then in between, you could do some with PDFs, or you could do some with your books, but then, of course, keep your book clean. Do use scratch paper on the side to better simulate the tablet version where you can't really draw freehand on the tablet.
Okay. Yeah. So in the scratch paper, I know you've addressed this in other videos before, but just for clarification, the scratch paper that they give us, is that handed out specifically during the games section, or they just give you a packet up front and you use it as you will?
It's for the whole exam. It's for the whole exam, not just games. It's a booklet of newsprint style paper, about 12 to 14 pages, 8.5 by 11, unlined. And so you could use it to make notes for reading comprehension. You could use it for a little bit of logical reasoning diagramming if you want. It's yours to use as you like. But of course, I would say you're going to want to use it mostly for the games.
Okay. So I just wanted to make sure we'll have the scratch paper for logical reasoning, because I write it on the wood with your finger, it's not going to work.
No. Okay, so we're just about up for today, but before we sign off, what would you say is the biggest insight you got from our session today?
I think me being so hung up on sufficient assumption questions, I really just need to go back and review properly and recognize patterns. I have not been trying to recognize patterns in the way the questions are written or the answer choices are written. I've just been trying to find out that specific question. And I think it would really benefit me to figure out a pattern, a style, and figure out where the test makers are coming from, especially when it comes to formal logic in the LR section. I probably knew that somewhere deep down, but I wasn't doing it. And now I have confirmation.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're going to make a change in your prep with this, and I'm excited to see where it takes you.
Thank you so much, Steve. You're such a help, and I truly, truly, truly appreciate your program. It's been so helpful for me.
I'm really happy to hear that. I really appreciate it, Kelsey.